acel știm noi, din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Right, hello there everybody and welcome. It's the return of the always popular Q&A session on this, the evening of Monday the 26th of May 2025, and we will be going through questions submitted on email and in the chat tonight. And as you can see from the side of the screen there, the chat is currently on display, so you can see questions that come in as they come in. So welcome everybody who has joined us so far. So we've got Working Prole Incorporated, we've got Svetlana from Moscow, hello to you. We've got RVA Klavek, we have Juvenal Silva, we have Zootzilla, we have Jenny, our moderator, we have Caustic Grip, we have Balkan Tourist, and we have Will Johnson in the chat. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. And we will begin by taking some questions from the chat. Then we've got a couple more detailed questions on email that we will jump straight into. So, right, getting into it with a question from Working Prole Incorporated over in Austria, I believe. Question, what rats will leave in Ukraine the ship first when Zelya's gig is up? His closer friends or the West? Well, the question of when the various rats will swim forth from the sinking ship is an interesting one. At the moment, the West, and I include in this the United States, is working double time to try and preserve the Kiev regime. And that really is what Trump's ceasefire talk was all about. Now, whether that's what Trump intended or not is another question, but that is essentially the practical impact of his policy, which is that he was demanding a ceasefire out of the Russians. The Russians quite rightly refused. Why would they give the US any concession of that really practically means anything at the moment? And given that they're winning the war, and so the whole question of the survival of the Kiev regime hinges upon, well, what do the Russians do next? And that's the interesting question. Now, given that the balance of forces in the US, if we take Senator Lindsey Graham seriously, is that he's got 80 senators, he claims, in the upper house in the US to back another sanctions package. And given that Trump is wailing and jabbering away about, like, oh my God, Putin, he's going crazy, he's killing everybody. I don't know what quite Trump thought he was doing with the bombing of Yemen, whether he thought that wasn't killing anybody. There is some speculation that Trump going nuts over the targeting of Patriot air defense systems in Kiev was because American personnel got killed in that. Maybe that's the case. But the negotiations, I have said for a long time now, will go absolutely nowhere, because the balance of forces inside the US and inside the key countries in Europe plus Britain are dead set against negotiations. They want this war to continue one way or the other. The only way they were going to accept it temporarily pausing was if they got to preserve the Kiev regime and bring what was left of Ukraine into NATO in all but name. Reminder, that's what the Kellogg plan really means. That's what it was. It was like they were prepared to admit, because they couldn't not admit it, that the 4 regions plus Crimea are under Russian control. They couldn't evade that, but they didn't want to. Actually concede anything with relations in regard to the fate of the Kiev regime and the demands that the Russians were making about, denazification, banning of Banderite organizations, and also the broader Russian demands that came out in late 2021 regarding the fate of NATO and NATO expansion in the East. They didn't want to address that at all, which is still something the Russians want to have addressed, must have addressed. So with all of that in mind, what's going to happen with regards to the fate of Zelensky and co? Well, Zelensky is just an actor. He's an actor being given lines principally by the British, with the US being in there as well. So what will happen is they will hold up Zelensky for as long as they possibly can until one of two things happen. Either, he can't quit. His way out of Ukraine is completely controlled by the West. He will only be allowed to leave when they regard him as having done his job, or that he's no longer any utility to them, or that they can get something out of him by having him head a Ukrainian government in exile. If those points are met, then he will be given a path out of Ukraine. If it is decided that he will be better off as a glorious martyr to Ukrainian statehood, then Zelensky will die, quite frankly. It just depends what the nature of the decision is in London and Washington as to his fate. He will want to flee. He will want to get out of there. He will not want to face the Russian army or his own enraged people who realize that they've been sacrificed for the profit of a few greedy oligarchs in Kiev and their political servants, plus the whims of the imperialists. You're already seeing videos emerging extensively of not just recruiters in the streets of Ukraine being resisted, but they're actually being chased down by angry mobs and beaten half to death. If that's happening out in the open now, the Kiev regime's authority and ability to rule is not looking good. So Zelensky will want to bail out the oligarchs. If they haven't bailed out already, will be going very soon. Most of the Ukrainian elite is currently either out of the country or have prepared their passage out of the country. So the question is not whether they bail. Those who can bail have already bailed. The question is, when do the Russians bring this to a conclusion? And that will only come, I think, barring some dramatic change in the Western negotiating stance, because at the moment there isn't a negotiating stance. There's just a demand that the Russians stop advancing, and the Russians aren't listening. So when will things collapse, basically? And I have said before that I don't think that the Ukrainian regime well, first of all, it can't negotiate because it has no agency. It's completely dependent upon the US, and if they can't agree anything because, again, they're completely dependent upon the US and the British, and to a lesser extent the Europeans. So this only comes to a close, as I have said before, when the Russians are forced by the fact that the Kiev regime cannot and will not quit to take Kiev. That is what it will take for the end of this. Barring, to pick up on Alan Smith's comment in the chat, barring an internal revolt, the only way that this equation changes is if there is a sizable and significant domestic revolt inside of central and western Ukraine. Now, there are, according to Colonel Jacques Beau, who has commented extensively on this on Daniel Davis's show, Colonel Daniel Davis's show, which is, he has chronicled that there are significant anti-Kiev regime but pro-Ukrainian independence resistance movements, even in the west of Ukraine, that are against the Kiev regime. So barring some kind of nationwide uprising that essentially destroys the ability of the Kiev regime to rule what is left of Ukraine, and as part of that, necessary revolt amongst the ranks of the military against the Banderites and against the NATO forces who are making sure that Ukraine stands on the front lines and making sure that the Ukrainian cannon fodder stay in their positions. Barring that kind of domestic revolt, which would change the political dynamics and military dynamics of the situation. So if that happens, then really it's a question of like, well, what kind of revolt is it that takes place in Ukraine, and what kind of settlement do any new authorities which emerge seek to make with the Russians? These are all questions which I don't have enough information on to make an informed judgment at the moment. So that could change if there's a significant domestic revolt that basically destroys the ability of the Kiev regime to rule. But other than that, what will bring it to a close is the Russians taking Kiev, which will be difficult, but they will have to do it if they want to prosecute the war to a victorious conclusion. And the Russians taking all of the major urban centers outside of Old Galicia, basically. And that will cause, of course, if it looks like the Russians are going to take Kiev, then the US and the British imperialists will be faced with a choice. Do they evacuate Zelensky and his clique and put them into work as a Ukrainian government in exile, stick Zelensky on the chat show circuit in the United States, or do they allow them to be caught and tried by the Russians? My prediction is that they will probably try and get them out, stick Zelensky on TV in the United States, and having had a useless government in exile that will probably implode after a few years. So that's my prediction on that particular question. So see, we've got a comment on this from Svetlana, who says, somewhat unexpectedly, the most fierce resistance to the press gangs is in the west of Ukraine, which has been so far, just scrolling down, the least affected, for over 15 months at least. I know Dissa, it's also fierce. That's an interesting development. So yes, we will see where that goes, basically. But to reiterate my answer to the question, it will take the destruction of the Kiev regime itself to make them quit and flee, because they will be extracted if they're regarded as having any political utility to the West. Zootzilla says, or rather asks, when will this war ends realistically, and is Trump really seeking a peace deal or just stalling for more time to bleed the Russians? Well, I've already answered that mostly. I mean, Trump doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. I think quite a lot of the time it genuinely depends, like who the last person he spoke to is. And he is, again, like don't forget about Trump. I mean, he's not as the former CIA agent, Larry Johnson says, he's not a significant political figure because he's not a strong political figure. He's a good bullshitter and a good on TV, but he's not a strong politician, nor is he of a particularly strong character. And so he can't stand up to all this pressure. So what I mean by that is, forget Trump's policy. The policy of the ruling class and their political servants and their intellectuals who do the thinking for them in the United States is to continue the war for as long as they can in the hope that something turns up. Either the sanctions work or some kind of internal problem develops in Russia, which forces an end to the Russian military action. But other than that, the war will just keep going until the Russians end it militarily, basically, is my answer to that one. Hello to Nikki, to ALM, who's a British, a perfidious Albion migrant living in Shanghai. Hello to Jerry. Svetlana asks, what is the likelihood of the communist parties in the UK are infiltrated by government agents? Very highly likely. What preemptive strategies, if any be employed to root out such agents? Thank you. Well, I would say that all of the communist parties in Britain will either be at various stages of infiltration by different informers, agents, etc. This is a ongoing. This is a natural problem for being in a repressive, anti-communist country, especially an imperialist one. We know from declassified MI5 files that the old CPGB Communist Party of Great Britain, which broke up in the late 80s, had been very heavily infiltrated by the secret services. They placed a really high priority on making sure that the Communist Party in particular was infiltrated. Even in its rotten revisionist state, it was still very heavily targeted by the security services. So we know from the so-called spy cops scandal, where they were infiltrating like Trotskyite organizations, anarchist organizations, environmentalist organizations, for various different reasons, that the British security state places a lot of value on these infiltration operations, and they continue to this day. Is it likely that there is some kind of agent or informer inside most of the communist parties in Britain? Well, I would say the major ones they would bother with. I certainly think that the Trotskyites are very heavily infiltrated, have been for decades. The CPB, well, I would say my guess is they probably are, because various members of theirs are in important positions in the trade union bureaucracy. Is my own infiltrated? I don't know. Is it likely that there's an informer somewhere in the ranks? Maybe. I don't know. Truth be told. Now, what preemptive strategies can be employed against such people? Well, at the moment, given that we're in the stage of building a communist party across the country in a new way, at the moment, the best defense against it is thorough and proper political ideological training, and also strict adherence to the theory and practices of democratic centralism. If you have a very high political level amongst your cadre, which is what we aim to do, what we aim to have, you develop your people to the ability where they can spot mistaken political lines or deliberately destructive political lines being touted by people, and violations of democratic centralism. And cadres can have the confidence in tackling people with mistaken political lines and also who are violating democratic centralism. Now, given what what infiltrators do in Britain and in the US as well, I think this is also true for most of the practices of the European secret services. What they aim to do is stage provocations, create problems in the party, especially those who are like paid provocateurs or paid agents, and try to split the party, try to damage it. Now, you can spot people who are trying to play that game quite quickly and shut them down if your party as a whole is strong, ideologically speaking, is constantly discussing and turning over in the internal debates the party's position on various different things. If all members are politically confident, if the leadership is strong and the practices of democratic centralism are solid, then provocateurs will have a very, very hard job derailing such a party. I mean, if you look at like the Bolshevik Party, for instance, the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, poured a huge amount of resources into infiltrating that and trying to destroy it. That was one of their major occupations, but they were unable to. Why? Under the leadership of Lenin, the Bolshevik Party was not only ideologically very strong, organizationally very well developed in terms of its practice of democratic centralism, of course, personified by Lenin himself. And so the Okhrana found it very difficult to destroy such a party. Yes, they managed to infiltrate it. Yes, they managed to probably turn certain individuals who'd been arrested, who'd been shoved in the Tsarist prisons, but they were unable to destroy the Bolsheviks. They were unable to derail them for the reasons I've just stated. So a good internal policy with regard to democratic centralism, following democratic centralism, making sure everyone understands it and adheres to it, and having a very well-developed membership and cadre who are confident in their understanding of Marxism, Leninism, and are able to tackle mistaken lines and spot provocateurs, then that is the best way of actually defending against this. Now, of course, as the struggle develops, and especially if we move into the stages of maybe facing increased state repression and having to run an illegal organization, then you would need to change your methods. You would need to do something like having internal security in terms of having very strict procedures for accepting people into the party, even more strict than you would do in these times. Actually having a unit in place that would be in charge of like hunting down infiltrators, spies, saboteurs, etc. You would need to do that if your organization got bigger and you were actually involved in a serious contest for power with the ruling class. Your tactics would need to change. But at the moment, it's about properly following democratic centralism, fully training and developing all of your members to the point where they can easily spot provocative actions and are confident in tackling them, and that the leadership is solid in its in having a very high political level and properly practices democratic centralism itself. The reason why the trot groups and the revisionist groups are so easily infiltrated is because they don't have any of that. They have a very low political level, where if somebody turns up and say has a van, which is how the cops used to infiltrate environmentalist and anarchist groups, the guy would turn up with like with long hair and a beard and like a load of tattoos and say, "Hey guys, I've got a van. What we doing?" And that would be it. That would be his ticket in. You wouldn't get that in a Marxist-Leninist organization that actually practices proper democratic centralism. Any cop trying to infiltrate that and get up to the highest level would have to go through a hell of a lot of training and a hell of a lot of party work before they got anywhere near a position of responsibility or have the ability to disrupt anything. Whereas with these other groups, you get in like that and you remember instantly, and you can get to a high position very quickly just by learning a few lines and learning to being a good bullshitter. So it's, again, we come back to political training and organizational strength. That's the best defense at this stage. As the struggle changes, we will need to revisit that. Right. Balkan Tourist says, what do you know about the imminent offensive in northeast and southeast Ukraine? Well, I know that everybody's talking about it. Whether that means it's imminent or not, I'm not sure. I mean, we've heard about this before, but certainly the Russians have a large amount of troops in reserve, which they are ready to use. They certainly seem to be softening up the front line. The internal situation in Ukraine, as we've just been discussing, is getting worse. And the ability of the Ukrainians to hold the front line is being compromised. So maybe we'll be facing a summer offensive. Quite how big it's going to be, I mean, well, that'll depend, I think, a lot on their success. If the Ukrainian front lines just collapse completely and like the Kiev regime starts to implode, then it'll be a bigger offensive. I mean, we don't know, for instance, here's another point. How much is this internal resistance inside Ukraine being coordinated with Russian special services? So how much is the resistance in central and western Ukraine being coordinated with the Russians? Is there the potential for like behind the lines action from these resistance groups at the same time as an offensive from the Russians? These are questions which we don't know about. But I would say that if we make an educated guess, that the Russians will be very interested in developing like behind the lines action from partisan groups that are cooperating with them. So imminent, quite how big it's going to be, we don't know, because the Russian general staff doesn't generally publish their plans on Twitter, unlike NATO, who very conveniently did a trailer for the Ukrainian 2023 offensive in the Zaporozhye region and gave the game away before they even started. So we'll see, basically. Right, where have we got to? Ryan asks, was the Capitol Jewish Museum shooting a false flag? I don't know, to be honest. I've seen a lot of speculation that it was, but I've seen no evidence that it was. For all we know, this guy who did it was just like some angry current or former PSL member who decided to go and do this. Now, until I see clear evidence one way or the other, I'm not going to speculate further, basically, because I haven't read the manifest, his statement yet. When I've read the statement, I'll do something more extensive on it. So I'll commit to coming back on that as the story develops. But at the moment, I'm just going to say I don't know. Lurtis, hello to you, who says the first new thing to happen will be further abandonment of Zelensky by European supporters as the expense of supporting him keeps growing. I don't know, man. I mean, I think they will try and keep him going till the bitter end. They're prepared to sink the EU countries into further and further debt and effectively cripple the euro for now. Whether that will change as things get objectively worse, I don't know. My guess is if it looks like it's going to be a complete and utter disaster and the whole thing is going to collapse, my prediction is that the Europeans might try to get out, but the British will just double down and back like underground Banderite terrorist organizations in waging a campaign against the Russians in the underground. That's what they'll do. So we'll see. I mean, bear in mind, the expense of keeping the Kiev regime afloat is as nothing compared to the prize at stake here. And the prize at stake has always been the total collapse of Russia and its resubordination to US and British imperialism. That's what they hoped was being done in the 90s with Yeltsin and Chubais and Gaidar and people like that in charge. The fact that those people were slowly eased out over a number of years by the Putin-led system, and it's always important to emphasize that it's a system, not a man. He's just the head of it. Tells you that what they want to get back to is a resubordination of Russia under a comprador regime. The prize of that is enormous. They're not going to get it. They're not going to get it because the reason why they got what they got in the 90s was because the counter-revolution that was led from inside the old CPSU by Gorbachev, Yakovlev, and others that completely destroyed all resistance to the compradors for a number of years. They're not going to get their comprador regime now. The Russian masses, I predict, I say rather, have started to awake and are not going to allow their country to be robbed blind again by the comprador clique. So, but they're still hoping. They're still hoping that they can do this. So they're not going to abandon this for a long time to come yet. Hello to Christopher Rogers. Let's have a look. ScoMo said, what's the difference between a people's democracy and dictatorship of the proletariat? Well, in theory, the people's democracies of Central and Eastern Europe after 1945 were coalitions between like communist parties, peasant parties, social democratic parties, which is what like Poland and Hungary and others were. In fact, I think in Hungary it was like a people's front government until like near the very end, which is reflective of like the forces that existed in 1945. So you had anti-fascist pro-independence movements in like Poland and Hungary, Czechoslovakia, who were like, you had peasant movements that were anti-fascist, you had social democrats who were resisting Nazi occupation, you had communists resisting Nazi occupation, and then behind all that, of course, then you have the Soviet Red Army liberating these countries, and then the People's Front governments that formed, they took certain socialistic measures, which, of course, the West screams about the fact that the Red Army did it. That's not true. What the Red Army did was just not act against the People's Front governments when they took socialist measures. Whereas in the West, in West Germany, for instance, when the the masses demanded socialist measures. A few concessions were made, but the West German authorities suppressed those like pro-socialist movements in Western Germany with the assistance of the British and the Americans and the French. So the difference was that in the Eastern and Central Europe, what happened was the Red Army just did not stop the expropriations that went on and the socialist measures that were taken. But the people's democracy element of it referred to the fact that you had a multi-party People's Front government, not a Soviet government with just the Communist Party in place in the government, which is what you have in Vietnam. I mean, China actually still has multiple parties in existence. The DPRK still has multiple parties in existence. It was the Soviet Union where there was only one in existence, which, of course, the CPSU itself. Okay, just getting an issue reported on volume here. So let's just double check that. We seem to be doing okay on the volume there. Okay, right. So Balkan Tourist says, nothing worse than hearing I'm a socialist and I support Ukraine. Well, they're neither socialists nor do they support Ukraine. If you actually supported Ukraine, you'd be calling for the overthrow of the Kiev regime, not supporting it. Greetings to Grassy Knoll from Seattle, Washington. Greetings to Carter Man. What should we make of the risk of nuclear Armageddon? It's a risk, but it's massively overblown. It's been massively overblown by the imperialists themselves and also by the revisionists. Khrushchev and his successors completely overblew the risk of nuclear Armageddon over and over again to justify compromises they wanted to make with the West. The same was true of the Gorbachevites later on. They had to say it was either Armageddon or these compromises, which is why they carried out those capitulations, justified by the fact that, well, we have to for the purposes of peace. So it's massively overstated, and it's not something that we as communists should be engaging in, the sort of nuclear war hysteria. Right. Okay, just going through. Alan Smith says the Radlibs will call any democratic centralism a cult. Yes, but of course they're a cult themselves. ALM says, how would you explain in plain language this between socialism and communism? I'm thinking particularly about the question of private property. Well, the question of private property is quite straightforward. When we reach the communism, particularly its higher stages, you won't have private ownership of the means of production at all. Now, again, to go back to basics for a second, the Communist Manifesto and subsequent writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao all make clear that, like, this isn't about the individual's right to own a fucking sofa or a car in these days, or any other material good. Private property refers to private ownership of the means of production and also the ability to exploit workers and peasants via the ownership of that means of production. So this is what is actually at stake here. So a difference between socialism and communism. Excuse me. I mean, in the way I look at it is that socialism refers to like the lower stages of development after the revolution. So you get the dictatorship of the proletariat, then you get the development towards socialism, which means like nationalization of key elements of means of production, and the beginning of the development of the planned economy, and that's the moving into the socialist period. And again, like this is like the you are in currently in that early stages, the fight for the development towards socialism. The communism, in my view, refers to the much higher stage of development, where you've moved beyond conventional state organization into what's referred to as the administration of things, where like the forces of the organs of repression that are needed in the early stage, in the workers' state phase, in the fight for socialism, are no longer required. Where like the key battles, key economic and ideological battles have been won in that fight for socialism. And so therefore, the higher stage, particularly in the higher stage of communism, you reach the kind of society that anarchism talks like it wants, but could never achieve because they've no idea how to get there. So that's the difference, in my view. Socialism is the lower stage of development. Communism is the highest stage of development. Hope that's clear. Alan Smith says, do you say van when you just show up with a van and you get in? Yeah, well, that's what happened with one of the cops. One of the cops that was infiltrating some environmentalist organization back in the day, it was in the 90s, he got in because he showed up and he said he had access to a van and could take them places. And that was it. He was in. And I was in an anarchist organization where there was a guy who had access to like all of our plans. And bear in mind, when we were anarchists, our main plan involved getting drunk cheaply, and that was about it. But yeah, the fact that you have a van and you basically can transport people up and down the country, that would get you into a lot of organizations. And the cops knew that. That's why they provided this guy a van, so he could easily infiltrate places. And it worked. No discipline, no organization, no politics. Very easy to infiltrate these organizations. All right, what have we got? Agricola says, even when I joined a sub-organization of the Party of Democratic Socialism in Germany, I was vetted by some Czechists. They still had back then. I guess Delinker don't. Yeah, there is no big no, there is a massive degeneration between the PDS and Delinker. Delinker is, for those of you who don't know, the German successor organization to the PDS, PDS was the organization in the east of Germany which succeeded the old SED, Sozialistische Einheitspartei, I think, Socialist Unity Party of East Germany, of the DDR, and then that merged with the WASG, which was a split from the SPD led by Oscar Lafontaine to form Delinker. Delinker then rapidly degenerated into a SOCDEM and Trot organization and just became like an identity politics obsessed mess that is now like it has many people within its ranks who are like a pro-Israel, pro-NATO, a complete and utter disaster, to say the least. Right. Edward says, what is your point of view on the thesis that the current era of working class politics is like the 19th century and that communism will come back in the West as a major force after welfare capitalism? I would say it's dangerous to make like-for-like comparisons. I mean, there are certain points of comparison, like the fact that working class politics in the West has suffered in the way that it did in the French Empire, French Second Empire, after the coming to power of Louis Bonaparte. And so working class politics there was essentially exterminated and drawn into the working class was drawn into supporting bourgeois tendencies. So there is a certain comparison to be made there. I mean, the damage that welfare capitalism has done is huge in terms of the retarding of the consciousness of the working class. So we're in a new period. You can learn a lot from certain historical comparisons, but it's dangerous to try and do like-for-like comparisons. So, for instance, like there's no real comparison with regard to the situation that Russia is facing now, because a huge part of the reasons why the Russian Federation can resist NATO is because of the socialist period. The October Revolution, even though they've tried to stamp it out, even though the Russian authorities themselves tried to stamp it out and destroy its legacy, couldn't do it. They couldn't reverse it. And the Russian bourgeois remain this stunted and degenerate group that can't do anything positive, that is. So we're in new territory, and you can learn something by comparisons to the 19th century, but I think we've got to be careful when we make those. There's nothing. We're not in like-for-like territory here. We're covering new ground. Trump crying over unscrupulous American mercenaries being wiped out seems comic. Yes. Vulcan Torres says Russia will create a no man's land 500 kilometers above buffer zone to minimize terrorist attacks. Yes. And Balkan Tourist also says, in Bulgaria, we have the Bulgarian Communist Party and Agrarian Party. Yeah, and the People's Front government. David King asks, will China send troops as they are next on the US hit list? I don't think so. I mean, maybe they've sent some forces to the special military operation to observe and learn. It's conceivable that they sent a few men to fight on the front lines. I don't know, though. It's not like the DPRK where they've got an open and acknowledged mutual defense pact with the Russians. But there's certainly Chinese officers will be there, probably in like H headquarters, learning from the Russians and learning from the war. As to a direct contingent of Chinese troops, though, I don't think so at the moment. They've been in Belarus, though. So they've made it clear they're prepared. They got certain agreements with the Belarusians. And I believe there was a Chinese contingent marching in the Belarusian Victory Day parade. So they're certainly capable of deploying that far out. But I would say they will not do it. Anything they do will be small and not openly acknowledged. Why did the Greek communists lose the civil war and the Italian ones fail to even engage in one? The Italian Communist Party went rotten very, very quickly, as Andrei Zhdanov observed. They put all of their faith in bourgeois democracy, and then when the CIA operation in the post-World War II Italian elections succeeded in rigging it against them, they basically capitulated at that point and vowed to pursue only democratic methods, meaning only bourgeois democratic methods. And so they turned from being a party of the militant working class slowly into just being a social democratic party that was seeking power only through parliamentarism. But of course, the US imperialists and the Italian ruling class routinely conspired to keep them out of power and to kill politicians who wanted to share power with them, such as Aldo Moro. So revisionism is why the Italians lost and failed to even engage in a struggle. Greeks lost. I mean, I would need to read a lot more about the outcome of the Greek Civil War. So I'm not going to venture an answer on Edward on the first part of your question, because I need to actually do more research on it. Certainly the US and the British threw everything at making sure the Greek communists were defeated. But I need to go more into more detail as to why that worked. Alan asks, do you think a socialist who doesn't believe in a planned economy is a socialist at all? No. Well, if you don't believe in a planned economy, what do you believe in? If you don't believe that economic planning is necessary to develop the country and also to actually develop the power of the proletariat, then what do you believe in? Probably nothing is my instinct there. Molotov Cocktail asks, if the US military or intel has bases in countries that border Iran, like Afghanistan and Turkistan, these could be used in any war with Iran. Well, they don't have anything in Afghanistan at the moment. I don't know about their presence in Turkmenistan. I know they have something there. Whether they could use that against Iran, I don't know. Given that Turkmenistan has decent relations with Iran, as far as I know. But more broadly, I would say it's not exactly a concern, because I still don't think the US is going to be capable of waging a war in Iran. Trump's blathering and threats and fist waving at the moment, and Netanyahu's posturing, is all designed to intimidate the Iranians into capitulating. They're trying to get them to capitulate to US imperialism over the nuclear program, and also to disarm Iran. They're presenting demands which whilst also trying to present the idea of US investment as a positive thing, to try and lure the Iranian compradors into making the kind of concessions that would essentially render Iran into becoming a vassal of the US again. The big thing that's stopping that is, of course, popular opinion inside Iran itself. So, and also the fact that the Iranians, regardless of whatever opinions they have on the contradictions and potential problems of the Islamic revolutionary system, None of them want to be reduced to vassal status by the US. So this is Trump's on a losing bet here. It really is. So he is stuck because they can't wage a war in Iran and expect to win. Even the wretched Gulf regimes don't want to be involved in this because they know it would end up with them on the chopping block, and Iran has the capability to do them a lot of damage. So I think the US is stuck. They could still try and launch war in Iran, but what good would that do? As I've said many times before, they can't invade Iran. They can do bombings, they can do terrorism, they can do assassinations, but they can't invade. And if they tried to, it would be enormously damaging and lead to a mass casualty event, which Trump would not survive. I don't think his presidency would not survive that. Even if there was some sort of wave of nationalism and propaganda in the US trying to drum up a war feeling with Iran, a mass casualty event that would, in the end, be fatal for US imperialism. Right. So who we got? Lurtis says also in 1947 France, the non-revisionist PCF was excluded, that is, from government precisely by military pressure. Exactly. Had there not been, in Italy and France, there was, and in Britain to a degree, there was an attempt to apply similar thinking that was applied in the East, in terms of that there could be like a People's Front government, which is what was an evolution towards a people's democracy, which is what was being done in Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. The difference was that whereas the Red Army just allowed these developments to carry on uninterruptedly, as Lurtis says in his comment, in the West, there was direct intervention to stop communist parties coming into power and to stop the development of people's democracies. Unfortunately, the French and Italian communist parties remained wedded to that position when it became clear that they weren't going to be allowed to go down that route, and that the ruling class would use the military pressure to stop the development of governments that included communists. Same would have been true in Britain as well. Hello to Eric in Brazil. Good to have you with us. Agricola says, I think it would be more likely Iran would send troops than China. If you are already an outcast, the rules-based order, you can't ruin your fame anymore anyway. I don't think Iran would. Also, I don't think the Russians need it at this stage. Edward asked, why haven't communist parties taken off in South America? Well, I think they have. I mean, there are very significant communist parties in Brazil, Argentina. There was a significant communist party in Venezuela. It's been damaged by splits. So, yeah, they haven't become ruling parties, but they are significant. Let's have a look through the comments here. Yeah, I need to look up the situation in the Ivory Coast. Haven't followed up on it yet. Slumbering Colossus says, an interview on a YouTube stream this morning, a historian made the claim that the dissolution of the Soviet Union wasn't legal. Well, it wasn't. Has reverberations over Ukraine as well. So the Soviet Union still exists. Well, it doesn't, because there's no country called the Soviet Union on the map. Look, the dissolution of the Soviet Union by the admission of the Russian Duma and even the current Russian government was illegal. Yeltsin, Kravchuk, and Shevchevich of Belarus had no right to sign those dissolution accords in, I think it's Belovezhaya accords that was signed in Belarus in 1991. That Yeltsin had no right to do that. Neither did Kravchuk of Ukraine, Shevchevich of Belarus. So, yes, all completely illegal under Soviet law. Still happened, though. So, and this is the problem, like a lot of things that were done up to 1991 were technically illegal under Soviet law. They were just done, and then nobody resisted it, not adequately anyway, and it just happened. It became reality. So I mean, I don't know what. I mean, I know that the KPRF makes a big deal out of this, and I suppose it's important to make the point to the masses in Russia and Belarus and elsewhere that like everything that was done to create the Russian Federation and the successor states to the USSR was done basically by a coup, via a coup being carried out by a tiny clique, which it was. Again, though, there is no country called the USSR anymore. Like, yeah, unless like there is some, unless like the paranoiacs in the West are right, and like Putin's going to take over Ukraine and declare that like the Belovezhaya Accords are reversed and therefore the Soviet Union still exists. I can't see that happening though. So I think this is an interesting point to make, but it's again like, what do you do with that? I mean, it's good. It's a good point to explore. It's a good thing to expose the truth about the dissolution of the USSR being essentially a coup carried out in the name of democracy, not just by Yeltsin and the others, but but also by Gorbachev and his clique. But again, doesn't mean that the USSR still exists unless there is some plan in place, which I am not aware of. Grassy Knoll asked, does the end of welfare capitalism mean that the governments will become more repressive? Well, that's been going on for years. It really has. So they've been getting more repressive since the 70s. It's just getting worse as time goes on. Question says Alm, anarcho-syndicalism is the default radical position of the Westerners. How would you explain its differences to communism? I'm not sure I agree with you that anarcho-syndicalism is the default radical position in the West. I think the default radical position in the West, and has been for many years, is basically social democracy. This is, which is essentially what Trotskyism really is, and what revisionism is. I don't think it's anarcho-syndicalism, to be honest with you. Now, as to the differences with communism, probably worth me doing a whole stream on that, so I'll make a note of it to come back to it in the future. I'd go on for way too long if I got into that tonight. F. Alba says, love your analysis, great political consciousness. I think today's Russian Federation is crypto-Leninist. What do you think? No, I don't agree with you. Because I think what you've got in Russia right now is a very interesting formation, which is basically it's basically a combination of like progressive Bonapartism with like some with pro-capitalist tendencies, reactionary tendencies, etc. But generally, it's been a progressive Bonapartist grouping running the country. It's not crypto-Leninist, I don't think. And one of the even though I would say that most of its personnel were trained in some form of Marxism, Leninism, even the revisionist variety, up to about 89, when Marxism, Leninism was formally like pushed out of the university system by the CPSU. So there is bound to be elements within like the thinking and the practices of like Putin and co, which bears something of some elements of Leninism, because that was their training. A lot of these guys, especially the guys of like Putin's age, who grew up in the 70s when Marxism Leninism was still officially the governing practice, organizational and political practice of the CPSU. So there's bound to be there's bound to be lingering traces of that in their thought, but I don't think it's crypto-Leninist at all. But what it is a fascinating case study in how the rhythms of the struggle, in this case, the struggle with imperialism, has changed so much about the Russian Federation. When Putin came to power 25 years ago, almost 26 years ago, the Russian Federation was a government of like comprador types being run on the grounds, being run like as a sort of Pinochet type operation. As the struggle against imperialism has gathered pace, what you've ended up with is a strange hybrid, which started as a sort of consolidation of national bourgeois forces compromised with comprador forces, where it's become more and more strongly nationalist, anti-imperialist in the sense of anti-US imperialism, and also it's become more aligned with the Soviet legacy than at any point in the previous generation. It's the Soviet legacy has been brought back, albeit in a distorted form, by the Russian government, because they've realized that the biggest claim to unity that they have, or the biggest element that can sort of gather the population around them in a unified fashion, is the elements from the Soviet period. It's not the Tsardom, and nor is it any other period in Soviet history. Edward says, I helped our comrade from the chat in Iceland to stage a communist takeover of the Socialist Party of Iceland on the 24th. Yes, Comrade Saifor, I believe. I will be following up with him soon on the program. Hello to Ash on the other side of the world there. I'll return to the anarcho-syndicalism question in a future episode to answer ALM's point. Is Burkina Faso a classic people's socialist revolution? I would say it has it's more in common at the moment with certainly the Sankarist past, and also with places like Venezuela, where you have like a progressive officers group leading things. But as to the exact role of the masses in the movement, I'll need to go into that in more detail before I can talk more confidently about that. But it's certainly got things in common with places like Nicaragua and Venezuela. And of course, its big inspiration is Sankaraism. Right. So I'll come back to that question in future episodes, though. Hello to Comrade Davey, who joins us. Clinton's question on Ibrahim Traore, I'll come back to in a future episode. What do you think about the Revolutionary Communist International? YouTube keeps bombarding my feed with their videos. Yeah, they're a Trotskyite organization, which are being deliberately promoted to drain, particularly to draw students away from joining like actual communist organizations. Edward says Anatolis Gorbunovs was head ideological curator of the old Latvian SSR Communist Party. He later led the counter-revolution in Latvia, and said that from 1988 onwards, Gorbachev became a dear friend and supported him. Yeah, well, I bet he fucking did. Right. Basic question, how does cutting benefits like winter fuel help capitalism in crisis? There's a couple of elements to this. Like, the money saved is really insignificant in terms of the actual money produced. I mean, a lot of this stuff is like cynical political gamesmanship. Like, one of the reasons why politicians carry out like cuts to things like winter fuel allowance is essentially as a way to prove themselves to the ruling class, and a way to like prove that they're willing to essentially carry out a class war. But this is especially true of people like Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. It's about proving themselves to the ruling class they're willing to do the dirty business demanded by the ruling class, and that's essentially why one of the big reasons why they do it. And of course, by reassuring the so-called financial markets, they hope to, of course, stave off a crisis of confidence in like British debt. So one of the reasons why they're always pandering to what the markets, and by that you mean what we mean by that, what people like Starmer really mean by that, is like the major owners of British debt. What they want to do is to reassure them that they're prepared to defend the status of British debt by essentially carrying out a class war on the working class. That's what it's really all about. and also by they did a work. They've ultimately been forced to reverse course on it. But the bigger issue, and this is the point that should have been made, is that, well, why do we even need to have a winter fuel payment to pensioners in the first place? We need to have that apparently because the price of energy is, in fact, this is very much the case, way too high for like pensioners to afford. How do you reduce the price of energy? Well, you nationalize the energy companies and expand domestic energy production, which is something neither the Labour Party nor the Tories here are prepared to do. So essentially, the winter fuel payment is a subsidy to the privatized energy companies. So if you actually want to save on payments to individuals, then you have to reduce the price of energy, which of course the capitalist class doesn't want to do, not really, and they don't want the government to do it either. They want to continue to leech off the working class by massively overcharging them for energy. And any measure to restrict the billing or reverse the bill or make it as low as possible could only be done via taking control of the means of production, the means of extraction of energy, and the means of and the distribution of it. So nationalization of energy extraction, energy production, and energy distribution as part of a national plan. That's how you would actually reduce energy prices. It wouldn't be by subsidies, which is what the winter fuel payment is. Still proper to oppose its withdrawal, but the restoration of it isn't going to solve the problems of like fuel poverty. Will you be doing a program on the people's democracies in Bulgaria and Romania? Eventually, yes. There's a very long list of things to get through, though. I'll probably need to do a proper full list of things that are on the schedule. What will be a communistic approach to genuine contraction in energy and resources? It asks Entropy Juggler. I'm going to put that one on the back burner for now and come back to it in a future episode. But tell you what, Entropy Juggler, be sure to email me that question because it's too interesting to talk about in a short period now. Edward says the main reason why there has not been a Russian offensive in 3 years is because of the need of the Russian capitalists to demand a deal and negotiate. They are still trying to do that. And they won't get one. They're not going to get a deal. This is the thing. They keep babbling away about one, but they're not going to get one, basically, is my answer to that question. Yes, they've been trying to reach a compromise with the US imperialists and the British, but there's no compromise to be reached. So, and now they're facing the Russian government is facing the Russian masses who have been politicized by the war and are not willing to suffer a sellout. So there you go. Right. Okay. So. Couple more questions. I'm just going to quickly turn to our stuff from the email here. Right. So, a question from Dean about the Spanish Civil War. And it wants me to do a little more unpacking of this situation. Now, I'll just give a sort of a broad explanation of this. Now, I've talked about the Spanish Civil War before and what were the contending elements to it. Now, the key reason, and I think this gets to the crux of the question, why the PCE, Spanish Communist Party, was in a lesser position in the Spanish Civil War when compared to the anarchists, when compared to the Social Democrats, because the anarchists had absorbed the energy of the revolutionary workers for a long time in Spain, going all the way back to the later 19th century, early 20th. So even after the October Revolution, you had, again, the revolutionary wing of the working class go for the CNT and the Iberian Anarchist Federation. The big trade union organization was still dominated by the PSOE, the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, which is still around to this day. It's the Spanish Second International Party. And what had happened was the PCE only really, the Spanish communists only really started to grow when the Civil War kicked off. Now, the Trotskyites claim, in following Trotsky himself, that it was the PCE Stalinists that sold out the revolution. They also claim that the anarchists sold out the revolution. Now, what essentially happened was, like, when the military pronunciamento occurred in 1936, the Spanish working class in the towns solidly and almost uniformly resisted the military uprising. So the initial uprising of the Spanish military, the coup essentially attempt that they were carrying out, was meant to go quickly and be another pronunciamento. It was meant to be another quick and easy coup carried out by the Spanish military, and then putting in place a military dictatorship. And it wasn't meant to be the civil war that it became. It was because of the resistance of the working class and the peasantry to a degree that the Spanish military was derailed. That, and the guy that was meant to lead the military dictatorship actually died in a plane crash very early on. So Franco wasn't even meant to be the main guy in this. But essentially, you had the heroic resistance of the working class early on. You had the anarchists in particular, and the Trotskyites, favoring like this decentralized militia system. And what happened there was that essentially the Spanish communists, together with the international brigades organized by the Communist International, tried to institute a more professionalized military system inside the Civil War period, because though the militia system had managed to successfully resist in many areas of Spain the military takeover, you were still left with a chaotic, decentralized system facing a large and professional army in the form of the Spanish army, with some very good units to it. Unfortunately, some of the best units were actually from Spanish Morocco, with significant international assistance from the Nazis, from the Italian fascists, from the Portuguese fascist regime, which was next door under Salazar. And all of that combined together made it very difficult to sustain a war based on like loosely organized militias. So the Spanish communists' role in all of this, even though they were a small part of this very unstable at times anti-fascist coalition consisting of the Spanish Social Democrats, led by Largo Caballero, the CNT, which was Confederación Nacional Trabajadoras, which is the anarcho-syndicalist union, and the Iberian Anarchist Federation. You had bourgeois Republicans opposing the military coup in a very shaky fashion. And what was needed was a unified army that could match the level of professionalism and organization of the fascists. This proved a problem because, unlike in the Russian Civil War, where you had unity around the Communist Party, what they were trying to wage in Spain was an anti-fascist defense of the Republic against the fascist uprising, which meant that the Communist Party were not only not in charge, they were on the back foot and in a minority everywhere in the country. So they did make a certain amount of progress because they proved themselves to be the best organized and the most determined fighters. And so you did get a move to professionalize the army. You did get a move to politicize the army with the creation of the political officers. And you did get a move to equip the army with Soviet weapons that were coming into the country. Unfortunately, though, again, though this sort of united front tactic against fascism was to work later on in World War II, to devastating effect on the fascists when waged by the Yugoslav and Albanian partisans, and to a very heroic attempt to liberate their countries by resistance movements led by like the French and Italian communists in World War II. In Spain, which was very much a trial run for all of this, it never quite worked to the degree that we would have wanted to. And part of that is because it was the Social Democrats and the anarchists that remained in the driver's seat, who were, and also the bourgeois Republicans, who were very shaky, and this incoherence proved in the end, I think, fatal. So it wasn't that, as the Trotskyites claim, that the evil Stalinists undermined the defense of the Spanish Revolution. It was that the fascists were better armed, better equipped, and had more enthusiastic, shall we say, and a great deal of international backing, whereas the Republic had some assistance from the USSR, but they couldn't get a lot in because the British and the French tried to ensure that there was basically an embargo on arms getting into the Republic. So it's very difficult for them to compete with the fascist forces. So far from being a revolution that was denied by the evils of Stalinism, which is what Trotsky claimed, what you actually had was an attempt to defend a bourgeois democratic republic in an unstable coalition with very shaky forces, that some of which were quite anti-communist. And in the end, this is part of the reason why the republic lost, was because the shaky and weaker forces remained a very much a key influence in the Republican government. And so the Spanish communists were never able to get like anything like full control over the defense of the Republic. And as a consequence of that, in the end, Madrid was surrendered via negotiation with the Francoists, with the fascists. The defense of Catalonia and Barcelona itself was undermined by the fact that the Trotskyites and the anarchists revolted against the central government for a while and caused chaos behind the lines, leading some correctly to point out that there was those in the Trotskyite organization, the POUM, that were collaborating with the fascists, and that's been confirmed. So this is like my overview of what was actually going on there. It was Trotsky's claim that the Spanish Revolution was destroyed by the Stalinists. I mean, this is all rot, nonsense, basically. There was a sincere attempt to defend the Republic by the Spanish communists, but they never obtained the level of influence necessary for them to actually succeed in that. Have I read Foster's History of the Free Internationals? Asked Slumbering Colossus. I've got it, haven't read it yet. Lertis says also British and French US non-interventionist blockade on Spain. Very true. One of my biggest disappointments into Tolkien was learning he was a fan of Franco. Yeah, it goes for a lot of reactionary writers. You got to take all this with take all Tolkien's political views with a bit of a pinch of salt. And when you read Lord of the Rings, yeah, you can still enjoy reading like Lord of the Rings. I mean, I've read some of it recently, and you have to laugh at some of the obvious bizarre English reactionary fixations that are reflected in it, and the sort of the reflections of the English class system. Maybe a Marxist review of Lord of the Rings will be forthcoming at some point. Okay. And Yepex asks, where can I find information on how many people capitalism has killed? There are various different predictions about that, which are different data sets about that. I mean, wasn't it called somebody did the White Book of Capitalism, appropriate title. White Book of Capitalism. I'm just going to do a quick search for it now. Yeah, there was a thing called the White Book of Capitalism and Democracy, which was, I've never read this, so I'm not sure of the veracity of this, but there's there has been attempts to sort of to count up the number of people killed in like various different imperialist interventions over the years. I'm just going to post a link to that now. It is on the Marxist Internet Archive. So there's other stuff as well, like there's like William Bloom's Killing Hope and various other things, various other books that have been written that were about trying to like quantify the number of people killed by capitalism. But though, truth be told, the number is probably so astonishingly high and hard to track that it would be difficult to come up with a really accurate figure. But I think that's one attempt to do it. But yeah, have a look at that and see if there's any decent information in there. I've not read it myself. William Bloom's Killing Hope is quite good for tracking like the casualties of U.S. interventions in the 20th century. Right. Okay. So we're going to be drawing things to a close for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again tomorrow. So be sure to tune in then. Until then, though, thank you for joining me tonight and good night.